Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a Lake Ontario evening on the topic of Ecohealth. This evening, we'll learn about the term Ecohealth, what the science says about Ecohealth, and how to take advantages of the many benefits that healthy ecosystems provide. My name is Valerie Frangella. I am the program manager for the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan, which hosts these events. Lake Ontario evenings take place 3 to 4 times a year, and they're always on different topics related to Toronto, the area of concern, and the Great Lakes. Thank you. So my co-facilitator this evening is Leanna Dandria, who you can see here. She's the Community Learning Coordinator at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and she will start us off with some housekeeping, followed by a land acknowledgement.
All right, thank you, Valerie, and welcome everyone. So if you are joining the webinar this evening by a smartphone or tablet, you should be able to swipe between the webcam view and the slides view. Hopefully you can see our slides and our webcams. We'd like to note that you have been muted to limit background noise throughout the webinar, but we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to share your questions and comments within the question box. We will address the questions at the end of each speaker, and if we have time at the end for more questions that we weren't able to get to. But please send in your questions throughout the different presentations so that Val can collect them and read them to the speakers during the different question and answer periods. And lastly, we'd like to note this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the Toronto Region Remedial Action Plan website, as well as shared with you after the presentation in our follow-up email. And we'd like to begin the event this evening with a land acknowledgement. So although we find ourselves geographically dispersed today, meeting here in this online environment, I'd like to begin by recognizing that we all work, live, and gather on traditional Indigenous territory. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands we are situated on are traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe of the Williams First Treaty Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Through our work with land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, TRCA appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land and is grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. And so we invite you to acknowledge the territories and treaty lands in your local area and invite you to visit native-land.ca to learn more about that.
So if you've joined us before, you know we like to get started with a couple of polls. Leanna, could you bring up our first poll for us this evening? So first question, is this your first time attending a Lake Ontario evening? I'll give you about 20 seconds here to select yes, no, or I'm not sure. I don't know how you wouldn't be sure, but maybe you attended an event at the Gladstone that you were in the past that sounded like it might be this. It was. It's the place where we used to hold these events.
All right, and we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And so, Val, it looks like just over half of the audience has attended one before.
Great, right on. Second question. Are you familiar with the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan? A couple more seconds.
Yeah, we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
I'll be just like 15, 20 minutes and I'll be out of here. I'm just going to record, but you guys won't be in the recording. Thanks.
All right, Val, it looks like 60% of the audience has not. Some are not sure, and about 35 said yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so for those of you who aren't sure, that's totally cool. For that 60% of you, I'll go through a few slides on what the Toronto Remedial Action Plan is. and then we'll launch into our presentations. So the Toronto Region Remedial Action Plan actually came out of a process that started in the late 1980s when the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes identified Toronto as one of 42 areas of concern in Canada and in the US. Areas of concern were areas where local environmental degradation posed a threat to the Great Lakes at large. Next slide. So each of these areas of concern was measured up against 14 potential uses that could be impaired. These were called beneficial use impairments. In Toronto, of the 14, we received 11, 8 were impaired, and 3 required further assessment. So the goal of the Remedial Action Plan is to address these impairments and to ultimately delist Toronto as an area of concern. Next slide, please. So that's where the Remedial Action Plan comes in. It is the plan, also called the RAP, you may have heard that term before, the Toronto RAP, which identifies projects that have been or are to be implemented by Remedial Action Plan partners in order to address each of the remaining impairments. Next slide. So in Toronto, over the last 30 years, we have made great progress by working with partners to implement projects that improve water quality, aesthetics, create and restore habitats, as well as populations. As a result, you can see that 5 of the impairments once listed are no longer impaired. We do have 5 remaining impairments and 1 that requires further assessment, and we are continuing to implement projects to address those that remain. If you do want to see our work plan, what projects we have planned, what's going on with the RAP, you can visit our website at torontorap.ca or follow us on Twitter at @rap_Toronto. You can also email me at any time and I'd be happy to fill you in on all of the different projects that are going on. Next slide. So though we rarely discuss remedial actions in the context of eco-health, there is growing evidence that humans gain physical and mental health benefits from healthy ecosystems and from having access to natural areas and biodiversity. I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to enjoy the many created and restored habitats and wetlands along the waterfront, such as those at Tommy Thompson Park, pictured here. This is where many Torontonians over the course of the pandemic have been getting their exercise. There are also more naturalized green spaces to come, including the Donmouth Naturalization Project, where new aquatic habitat and green space is being created at where you currently find the mouth of the Don River, and where it is going to follow a new path and have all of this great green space around it for all of us to enjoy. Okay, so that's the introduction to the RAP. Again, you can follow up with me if you have any questions about it. We don't want to spend too much time on that because we do actually have Ben Porchuk as our first presenter, and he's waiting outside, possibly facing a thunderstorm this evening. Ben Porchuk became Canada's first certified forest therapy guide in 2015. By 2016, he was a trainer, and in 2018, he co-founded the nonprofit organization GIFT, the Global Institute of Forest Therapy. Prior to founding GIFT, Ben had over 2 decades of experience as a wildlife researcher and worked in nonprofit management, environmental consulting, and sustainable living. Ben is currently working as a contract ecologist and part-time leader of GIFT. He uses his skills and experience to help design restoration projects and recover natural habitats on rural and urban properties using native plants in wetlands, prairies, forests, and more.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thanks so much, Valerie. Can you hear me fine?
We can hear you very well.
Great, great. Just I'm by this amazing old oxbow of the Coves sub-watershed in London, Ontario, and as a male duck just swam by, it occurred to me, you know, if you've ever asked Drake, the performer, if he would, you know, back the Toronto RAP, it seems like it would make sense to me.
We do have a lot of accidental visits to the Toronto RAP website.
I bet. Good for viewership. So All right, well, nothing like starting off with a corny joke. And, you know, we are going to jump right into a couple of polls because some of the information I'm about to share is related to the polls. So if we could have the first of two polls. You think a guided forest therapy walk provides a different experience than a non-guided walk in the woods? And I guess we'll have about 30 seconds for this. And the reason for putting a post or a poll like this is that we're frequently asked this question, and not only asked, but a lot of people will say, you know, I've been forest bathing for 30 years, which is great for those people. For me personally, I really didn't know how to be in nature until I took the forest therapy training 6 years ago. And
Ben, you're cutting out a little bit. Are you able to get closer to your microphone?
yeah, sure, yeah. So I think that might have been just the wind. So it was perfect just a minute ago. Does that sound better?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. I'll kind of turn like this so that the mic is shaded from the wind. Yeah, so the second question here, okay, here are the results. 90%, well, that's not what we usually get, but that's great to hear because I'm going to explain a little bit about this. So I guess we'll do a little bit of the talk, and then I'll go to the second poll. And remind me if you can, in case I don't get to that. So forest therapy, actually, when you look at it versus just walking in the woods, one of the main reasons why we find a difference is that it really takes us into that parasympathetic nervous system, whereas when we're just walking in the woods on our own, we have a tendency to think a lot, to talk, to maybe be out there for a different motive, for exercise or for identifying things. And so we're in our mind, we're not in our senses. And when you're on a forest therapy walk, it really focuses on not exclusively, but primarily silence, moving slowly, and not moving very far at all. So it really is a different experience for a lot of people. And having done some work with the city of Markham and designating some forest therapy trails there, we get consistent letters from people saying, I've walked this trail for 30 years, and now that you've put up a self-guided forest therapy trail, it's like a completely different trail to me. And so it is really a different experience. And because we're talking about science here, and I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to get into some of the things that are scientifically proven. And I say scientifically proven because scientific research has its limitations. And of course, to really get at the heart of some of the questions, we have a lot of variables that we can't always control for. But in general, what the research has shown in Japan and South Korea and many other countries across the world doing research is that a forest therapy walk lowers your blood pressure. It increases your heart rate variability. If you have cancer or some form of tumors, research has shown that in some cases it shrinks the tumor to completely expelling it from the body. It helps us recover more quickly from surgery. It's a mood stabilizer. And if you have things like attention deficit disorder, it's a bit of an antidote towards that, quite an antidote. So those are some of the general research terms that we're talking about when we're talking about ecosystem health. And of course, this is more about personal health, but a lot of research has also shown that when a person engages in nature connection activities, including forest therapy, they are more likely to treat the environment with greater stewardship values and have a genuine desire to want to do something and to stand up for issues in their communities. So I really should show you around a little bit. There isn't a lot of time here, and like I said, I wanted to be outside because we've been inside for so long, and now that we're all figuring out the technology, we can do this outside. Even though I certainly wasn't in my parasympathetic nervous system when I was working on this with Valerie earlier when we were trying to figure out all the technical stuff. But now, actually, after having set it up here since a little before 5 p.m., with the bird sounds, with the reflection in the water and the occasional passerby, I'm really settling into what we call resonance. And if you have any kind of a nature connection practice, like sit spot, for example, you'll know that if you go repeatedly to the same spot in particular, that a lot of the animals and even the plants, and that sounds funny, plants, but they start to accept you and start to behave as though you're just a part of the environment, because of course we are a part of the environment. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things after I show you around a little bit here. Hopefully I don't lose you. So this is an oxbow of the Thames River. And as I mentioned, it actually separated from the Thames River about 300 years ago. And now it's just a gentle meander of 3 ponds. And the really nice thing is that, you know, for me, it's a stone's throw from my house. There are about 30,000 people that completely surround this natural area, which means nature is nearby. And of course, having nearby nature is one of the best things possible. It might not have exactly what national parks or provincial parks or other natural areas have to offer, but it has something that trumps that all the time, is that you can take a minute or two and either walk there or have a really short car ride with no packing except for some water and maybe your phone and something else, and you're out there. So nearby nature is critical. And maybe we'll go to the next poll here now, and I may have already answered this. No, of course, I couldn't answer this. Have you ever been on a guide-led forest therapy walk? And chances are, if you haven't heard of forest therapy or forest bathing, or as it's said in Japanese, Shinjin Yoku, which literally means to bathe in the air of the forest, you're going to hear about it everywhere now, because there are, in addition to the Global Institute of Forest Therapy, there are organizations around the world training people to become forest therapy guides. And again, for some people, this is kind of comical. But again, like I said, I was an expert in some areas in the environment. Well, let's see here. Okay, so about 14%. That's pretty good given the era. You know, when I did this 6 years ago, the training, it was, you know, virtually unheard of in North America, but of course in other parts of the world it had been really, really popular. So yeah, now you'll see this virtually everywhere. The trainings are found across the world. The popularity is really surging. There's a lot of not just evidence for the science, but when you try a forest therapy walk, it's the experience that puts you back in time. Often people will say, to the childlike euphoria of having simple pleasures. And the way they work is they are designed to get you out of your thinking mind. So you might think mindfulness for sure, but a guide is also trained in being that conduit so that we can get the maximum amount of connection between the person and the environment again, because we have to reconnect a lot of people. And of course, the more we're in that parasympathetic state, that rest and relaxation mode, the more our bodies are able to heal. And some of the things really quickly, because I'll talk about the senses, is the smell. Now you can't smell this unfortunately, but you can probably hear the train that's going by. The train is a few kilometers away, but the smell is actually, the smell comes in primarily through things like water and soil, things that we're accustomed to when we're outside. The research indicates in North America that 90% of us spend our time, 90% of our time is spent indoors. That's the average person in North America. So when we get outside.
We can barely hear you, Ben.
Okay, is that any better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, yeah, so 90% of our time we spend indoors. And when we get outside, it's quite remarkable how things like as simple as smell come back to us, and it elicits memories from when we spent more time outside, often when we were younger. The one that a lot of people talk about is the smell of conifers and oak trees, and those are called phytoncides, which are essential wood oils, and they are airborne tree medicines that ward off insect, bacterial, and fungal infections. When a human inhales these, it not only gives you that strong smell of pine and makes you relax, but it actually stops your cortisol production, which is your stress hormone. and immediately you move towards that parasympathetic state. But what some research has found in places like South Korea is that if you go to sage, for example, and you get that smell of the pine or the hemlock or the spruce, any of these conifers, and you put it in a bottle and you pump it through an office setting, people in the office will pause and they'll look at each other, they'll take a big inhale and they'll breathe a sigh of relief, they'll relax, and then they get right back to work, and there's no positive effect whatsoever. And that's because, of course, they're focused on their brains and their productivity. And so there's so many of these scientific things that we talk about in nature that we don't really know how they work in combination. But just to say it quickly, because I know I'm probably out of time, there are things in the air, in the sky. You see patterns of fractals in the sky, in the clouds, in the ripples on the water. These bring us back to the parasympathetic state as well. And when we hear birdsong, which you might be able to hear behind me, that also completely soothes us and makes us feel at home because we co-evolved with birds. Our systems were designed to know what a calm bird call is versus a panic bird call or an alarm call when we start to get into a different state because we know a predator might be nearby or something else. And other things too, as the wind picks up from the east, which means a storm is coming in soon, things like the earth below me, the Schumann resonance, it's this universal hum that we have in the world. It's 7.83 hertz. If we're inside, we don't get that. We block our circadian rhythm. We don't have the same sorts of things that are impacting us, and we can't sleep as well. And so the science really works on all of the different senses, going at things from touch, for example. So if you're looking at being outside, and if you have your feet in a creek, for example, I know a guy who's starting his PhD called Feet in the Creek, looking at how a creek will actually start to move away positive ions. And this is really critical because this enhances our blood. It really impacts our immunity. It does all sorts of things, and we're really just beginning to uncover a lot of things. And the last thing that I'll say is that the research shows that your immunity, if you go on a 3-hour forest therapy walk, will be boosted for a week. If you go for 3 days, you'll have a boosted immunity for a month. And boosted immunity means you'll have a higher level of natural killer cells in your blood, able to fight off viruses, all sorts of things, much more readily than not having gone out there. But of course, you guys know all of this stuff, maybe not in the details, and a lot of the details we can forget easily. The important thing is to embrace a lot of these modalities that we're starting to look at scientifically, but also magically as well. And at the beginning I said, who knows how these things work together? I often call myself a recovering scientist. And this is because a lot of our work is with First Nations communities and elders. And one of the first things an elder said to me on a traditional medicinal native plant inventory that I was leading is he said to me, get down on the ground and have a conversation with that plant, and then start showing us all of the knowledge that you have. And I was sitting there for a couple of hours with a bloodroot plant, and I got a lot of information. And of course, now, so much information is coming out about trees and their sentience and how they support each other with the help of fungi underneath the soil. And some of the latest research is showing that the bark in trees has the same type of cells that we have in the back of our cornea. They're light sensitive cells such that a tree can actually tell the color of clothing that we're wearing as we approach it. So there's so much more to learn and so many ways to learn it. And I'm super grateful. Thank you guys very much for having me on here. And our website is giftoftheforest.com, and I'm happy to answer any emails or questions if we have any time now. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Ben. That was wonderful. We do have several questions here for you. And you have plenty of time left, so feel free to elaborate a little bit. I know you were rushing there, so yeah, feel free to take as long as you need to answer these questions.
Super.
Our first, yes. Our first questions, we got a couple about how to access the guided walks, particularly the one that you referenced. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's easy. Go to the City of Markham's website and go to, I think it's a tab called Trails. And you can find, they either call it Shinjin Yoku, which is spelled Shinrin Yoku, or Forest Bathing Trails. And they'll give you maps of actually 5 trails that we have established in Markham. And it's as easy as that. Or we have it on our website as well. And I gave that out earlier.
Great, and we will also include that website in the follow-up email, so everyone will get a copy. You don't have to write it down right now. So our next question, and this, maybe you've already answered this with your website, but can you suggest some sites to get the training for becoming a forest therapy guide?
Yeah, sure. I endorse a couple of groups around the world. The Scandinavian Forest Therapy organization, I can't remember the exact group, but if you go to Sweden and type it in, it's an amazing group. There's also a really great one in Australia. And just type in Forest Therapy International. I think it's in Australia. And of course, ours is giftoftheforest.com. And after knowing a lot of these groups, these are the top ones that I would recommend, but there are others around the world. And, it is an investment. And I found it challenging 6 years ago. It was the wrong time for me and my family financially, just about everything. And then when I reviewed it with my wife, we were just like, we had to make it happen. And so we did. And we've had that experience with a lot of people who've trained with us. So if anybody wants to write in and ask someone who's taken the course, we have, quite a few people who have. They can give you a first-hand account of what it's like to be on either the 8-day training or the distance study program, which is spread out over 6 months. And these trainings, even though they are a big investment, they're about $4,000. They we just have lots of people that that are really satisfied, and that's not the right timing for some people. We totally understand that, but definitely write to us, and we can connect you with some people who've been through the training and been through some of those questions that you might have. And of course, I've been through the training, but I'm directly related to one of these groups, so you might want a third-party perspective.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. And as a follow-up to that, folks are asking if there's a Toronto local training course. Would you be the closest to Toronto for that?
Yeah, there is one actually in Hockley Valley. Actually, there are 2 of them. One's running in, I think it's in July, and the other one's in September. And those ones still have some space available. There is one in Thunder Bay also in September, and I had no idea how incredible the city of Thunder Bay is and the region of the boreal forest, the southern edge. So that one, even though it'd be a little more expensive because of the travel, and Hockley Valley is incredible. I would recommend Thunder Bay. And of course, you're on the Niagara Escarpment in Hockley Valley, so you would have an incredible experience there too. But the northern communities, it's just totally opened my eye to how amazing they are.
Yeah, amazing. It's a beautiful part of the province.
Yeah.
Ben, do you know if there are any forest bathing benefits related to diabetes?
I don't know if there are actually. That's a good one. Like we have someone recently with, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I just heard an echo. Yeah, so the short answer is I'm not sure if blood sugar would be related to that, to be honest. Even though, there are so many different systems that that come into play, that blood purification, for example, through running water because of like a negative ion wash. So I don't know if anybody has actually done that research, to be honest, and I don't think so, because I have done a comprehensive review of pretty much all of the research. I'm not current over the last few weeks because new studies are being added, but we do now actually have a GIFT research group, which includes researchers from Harvard Medical School and amazing schools in Europe, around the world. And we are looking at a lot of these questions now related to both nature connection and health research. So that might be a really interesting one to consider. And it wouldn't surprise me. And again, you know, it's not the solution to everything to go on a forest bathing walk, but more and more. Like today I got in the mail the Costco Connection magazine. Right on the cover, it said, like, get an antidote of nature. And you go into the article, and it's talking about forest therapy and BC parks, how doctors are recommending that you get outside, and has a big section on forest bathing. So it's a bit of a watershed time where it's hitting mainstream. And we're really excited about this because we are collaborating with some really big parks organizations, and we'll have some big announcements soon. For example, Gross Morin National Park contracted us to create a designated forest therapy trail in Gross Morin National Park. I was there a year ago, and this year's trip was canceled, but oh my gosh, is it exciting? And it's going to be a lot more accessible as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I love Gross Morin National Park, a beautiful, beautiful place.
Oh, couldn't believe it.
So we have a couple kind of related questions here. The first is, hi, as a field naturalist, as well as a longtime meditator, I'm curious to know what forest therapy offers in comparison to a walking meditation in the woods. Let's start there.
Yeah, that's a great one. Well, it really depends on the person. Like a walking meditation would be wonderful. And, you know, for me, for example, I did a 500-hour course on yoga teacher training, and I've never taught a course in my life, but I really wanted to know it in depth and detail. And I found consistently that I didn't really do a full class without an instructor there. And when I had an instructor, and now it's an instructor online, but there's still a connection, I did the class more deeply. And so, you know, I found for me personally, and this is what a lot of people will say, is that you get into a greater depth. Plus,
sorry, Ben, we can't hear you. Can you lift the mic a little?
Yeah, so you get into more depth for sure when you're with a guide. And the other thing is that the creativity and the guide's ability to step into the moment and to really find the place of deep connection with what's going on around them and with the group or individual that they're leading them. I found, you know, after having led 250 walks myself over 6 years, that when I go on a walk with a guide, they bring associations and connections within me in the natural world that I had nowhere in my consciousness and my creativity to bring notice to that. So I have found personally that I need to go on walks myself, being led by other people. And of course, you know, when you're leading them yourself, you're definitely getting a benefit, because after it becomes automatic for you to lead a walk, you know, you can help a person connect more deeply the more connected you are yourself. And so if you're nervous and somewhat stressed, it's really hard to get that across to the person. But again, this is kind of outside of the question. You can certainly get a lot from a meditative walk in the woods. I know, like, when I first met my wife a long time ago, and we were walking in the woods, and I was showing her all the different birds and the animals and the fungi, pointing everything out, she finally said to me, "Can you be quiet so I can enjoy this walk for a little while?" And I kind of went, well, okay, you know, I didn't know what to do, but because for me, that's what being in nature was. And that's why when I did the training, I was really brought to my knees. And in the training, which a lot of people experience, if you have a gift or two, which we all do, it becomes so heightened when you get into that deep state of nature connection, which I'd never been on. So for example, for me, I've always been a casual, illegal rehabilitator of wildlife. I just find sick and injured animals from all sorts of things, from skunks to eagles. And I would bring them in and rehabilitate them. When I was on the training, I found the ability to approach animals in the wild and calm them to the point where I could touch them and just kind of look around and think, you know, is this somebody's pet? And you know, so this is just really a testament to a lot of what we've lost, right? Because we all have so many gifts that are untapped or forgotten or never really discovered. And so that's a really big, beautiful part of the nature connection practice for me, is that the depth is almost limitless.
Great, thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that one. Are there exercises that people can do on their own in the forest to take part in maybe a more forest therapy-like walk?
Yeah, absolutely. And two of the biggest invitations for yourself are to go ridiculously slow. Like maybe imagine yourself when you're 112 and you've got this one last walk in the forest. Imagine the gratefulness and the gratitude that you'd be moving with, and how you would measure your steps, and you know, to go in silence as well. And you can even do this with someone else and say, you know, do you want to go on a silent walk? And that's definitely one thing for sure. And then if you can bring in breathing, which one of the participants asked earlier about, what if I do a mindful walk, a meditation, for sure. That's always tied with deep breathing, right? Because most of us are only getting a tiny fraction of the capacity of our lungs in any given breath. When you add a deep breath to slowness and silence, miracles are just waiting around the corner. And they're, you know, they're tiny miracles, or they're big miracles, or they're epiphanies. And they're things that, you know, if they are epiphanies, because this is what I have to watch. When I get into nature in that state, it really starts to boost my creativity. And when I get my creativity, my mind says, oh my gosh, we could capitalize on this. This is incredible. And then that takes you out of it as well. So I would say start with slowness and silence, deep breathing, and just the reverence and gratitude for being in that place, in that time, and look around too at the sense of place. Like I have to do this again because the you know, the sun has come out, the threats of the thunderstorms have subsided. And you know, as I'm talking to you guys, this is in my background here. Sorry for saying guys, I'm not supposed to say that anymore to you amazing people. Yeah, so you know, I'm really totally feeling this reverence right now. And then beyond that, there are other things, like we call them invitations instead of activities, because when you say activity, people often equate that with working, right? Like I'm going to do an activity and work. When they're invitations, it's like, you know, I might have the invitation to go on this walk, and I'm just going to smell things. I'm going to focus on my nose, or any of the senses. Pick one of them and maybe take a tiny stretch that you would normally do in 5 minutes and spend an hour going through there. And you can do this with sight, you can do it with hearing. And the more you resonate to that particular spot, the more things will actually appear. And I actually noticed this when I was doing my graduate research on snakes, of all things. But I would be sitting there taking field notes and finally slowing down and just enjoying the sight. And, you know, for example, I work with a snake called the blue racer on Peely Island, and extremely hard to find, hard to catch. A couple of them ended up moving right across my lap because they actually could pick up on the smell of other snakes.
Oh, sorry, Ben, we're losing you here.
Yeah, okay, where did you lose me? The wind was picking
A
up.
couple of them raced across your lap.
Yeah, well, not raced across my lap, but slowly moved across my lap. I know that some people might find that, you know, very discomforting because of, you know, their fear of snakes and reptiles. But for us, it was a bonus, and it was really because about becoming a part of that particular location and about not posing a threat. And so some of the best wildlife observations are people that really can sink into a spot. Definitely try a sit spot. So try and find a spot nearby so that it's not onerous to get to, and get comfortable and stay there for at least 20 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week in silence. And you'll find the resident birds that are nesting in that area, so not the so-called exciting migrant, they'll begin to accept you and often come very close to you and not even worry that you're there.
That's very cool. Thank you, Ben. So we're basically out of time, but I will share this question comment. Not being facetious, but have you ever met a plant who didn't like your presence?
Well, that's a great question. And we end a forest therapy walk with a tea ceremony where after we've sampled the environment, and I hate to say sample because it's consumerism language, but after we've taken in a particular place with our senses, then we ask a plant if we're able to wild harvest, wild craft, pick a small part of the plant so that we can add it to hot water in an infusion. And sometimes plants will say no, and sometimes that's a lot of the information you're getting super quickly from the site. Like the plant doesn't have a lot of leaves to offer, maybe it's only got 1 or 2 berries or something. So who knows where that's coming from? So in that regard, for sure, I have seen that. But more often than not, the plants are willing participants. So thanks for the tongue-in-cheek question.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ben. We'll have to wrap up our questions now. We do have some extra questions in the question box. If anyone would like me to pass on a question to Ben after this presentation, please do send them my way, and we'll try and get those answered for you. But I think we got to most of them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. We're going to be out of this soon, I feel, and I know all of you can get outside. So, and thanks a lot to you guys as well for organizing this. This was great.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate you braving the almost storm for us. Oh, here we go. Great. So next up, we have Pegeen Walsh. As Executive Director at the Ontario Public Health Association, OPHA, for the last 7 years, Pegeen supports OPHA members and its expert work groups in advocating for healthy public policy, offering professional development, training and knowledge exchange, and collaborating with multi-sectoral networks to affect change. For example, she serves as co-chair of Ecohealth Ontario. Pegeen brings a background in public service, having held executive roles in the federal, provincial, and nonprofit sector, with agencies such as the Ontario Ministry of Health Promotion, Public Health Agency of Canada, Health Canada, and YMCA Canada. Welcome, Pegeen.
Thank you. I'm just in this state of well-being, just having that chance to even see nature through their screen, I found was very soothing, and the noises that we were hearing. And thank you so much for having me as part of the discussion tonight about Ecohealth, and what a great way to kick off our discussion. I was thinking a lot about this term of gratitude and reverence, because with the pandemic, we've been separated physically, and I think many of us are not only yearning for that personal connection with those we care about, but also that connection with nature. And I know in places that I've been going throughout Toronto, where I live, I'm just seeing so many people that are out and about, and they're trying to find that connection back with the physical environment. And I've been very fortunate because I have been working from home during the pandemic. And so I've been finding all these new places and discovering places in Toronto where I can go out and be with nature and feel that sense of reverence and gratitude and connection, and benefiting from the health consequences of that. And I had a chance to go to Gilwood Park on Sunday, and I wanted to start by showing you this picture that I took there and to ask you what you see. So as you see this photo from Gilwood Park, do you see land that's owned by the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, biodiversity, wildlife, there's a deer, climate change mitigation, health promotion? What stands out for you as you look at this picture? So we're just going to do a quick poll to see what people are seeing.
I may have launched that a bit preemptively. I hope folks were able to get a quick glimpse of the photo.
I'm not seeing the poll myself.
We are seeing votes come in. I think it might just
Okay.
be because you're presenting.
Okay, okay.
So I'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
So if you could just let me know what you're seeing, the results, because I'm not able to see that.
Yes, so most of the audience said biodiversity, a few chose land owned by the TRCA, and a few others chose wildlife and deer and health promotion, but overwhelmingly biodiversity.
So I was thinking about Ben and his remarks about what happens when we often walk through nature. And I was enjoying being on the trail and walking, looking left and right, but not really with that slow connection. And then I noticed one by one people ahead of me stopping, and then that quietness and turning around and encouraging others to be quiet. Otherwise, I would have walked right by. There were 3 deer hidden in the woods. And as I wanted to share this picture because it made me think about Ecohealth, that it's been there all along, that it's right in front of us. But sometimes it's hard for us to see, and that's what I wanted to do tonight, is just examine that closer. Because so often when we're seeing something like that, we're not thinking necessarily this is having an impact on our health, not just the environment. So I'm very excited to tell you about some collaborative work that we're doing at Ecohealth Ontario to shed light on this critical issue that impacts public health, planning, parks, conservation areas, cities, schools, communities, and more. I wanted to check in first with others to see how familiar you are with this term, Ecohealth. Is it something that's a new term for you? You're somewhat familiar, you're very familiar, or it's something that in fact you've been trying to incorporate in the work that you do or in your day-to-day living? Yeah, so again, if you could show me the results of those polls or speak to it, because I'm not able to see that on my screen.
Yeah, so we'll keep the poll open for another 3 seconds there to get your votes in. And we'll close. And Begin, it looks like about 30% of the audience said it's a new term. 40% said they're somewhat familiar, and about 10% are very familiar, and 17% chose the last option there.
Okay, so we can see we have a real mixed group in terms of people's familiarity with this concept. So as I said, I want to describe work we're doing at Ecohealth Ontario, and specifically I want to focus my remarks on 3 areas. I want to tell you a bit about who we are and why we've come together, what we're hoping to accomplish, highlight some of the resources and tools that we've created that you might find helpful, and then offer some ideas and hear your suggestions about things that lie ahead and how we should be thinking about the future. But most of all, I hope by the end of my remarks that you also share that sense of urgency that my colleagues and I feel about the need to embed these eco-health concepts into planning and decision-making, be it at the local or provincial level and beyond. So let me start by talking about Ecohealth Ontario. So it was in 2013 that some partners, including some from conservation areas, came together because they were very concerned about what they were seeing as disturbing trends that were affecting communities: loss of green spaces, increasing rates of disease, and the impacts of climate change. And they realized to tackle these issues that it was going to take an intersectoral approach. And they were very inspired by what is being described as a collective impact approach. And that's a recognition that in order to make lasting change, we need organizations to come together and coordinate their efforts and to work in new ways around very specific goals. So my colleagues who started in 2013 saw the value of these collaborations among human health, social, environmental sectors to implement and share a common vision that recognizes and promotes the important connections between health, ecosystems, and our well-being. And just to go back, you can see the range of groups that came together. You can see there are public health units. There's our association, Ontario Public Health Association. You have watershed management groups such as conservation authorities. You've got nonprofit groups like Forest Ontario, Ontario Parks Association, and many others. So this is giving you a picture of our steering committee. And we do have over 200 different groups and individuals who are part of our network, which is growing all the time. So building on that, that interest in collaboration, this is our shared vision. We are looking for an Ontario where everyone can see the benefits and benefit from the provision of well-distributed and high-quality green space, and that everyone is aware of its contribution to health and well-being and also has access to its benefits. So again, we wanted to come together because of that growing evidence, and you heard Ben speak about what we're learning more and more through research around the health impact of a healthy physical environment. And we saw about the pressures that climate change is creating. We saw the increasing prevalence of disturbing trends related to physical and mental health. We needed that policy that is so often fragmented when you look at local, provincial, and federal governments in terms of health being separated from environmental issues. And we saw that there was a lot of inequality as well in terms of who can access green spaces or parks. And then again, that continued loss and degradation of green spaces. So again, we saw very compelling reasons to come together to achieve our shared goal. I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble, but for whatever reason, my cursor is moving very slowly this evening. So I wanted to take another poll and just check in. Now, you did hear some hints from Ben, but just to check in terms of what you think are the most health impacts of the environment. How does the environment impact health? Is it related to a physical activity, mental health, air quality, climate change, reducing inequalities, all of the above?
So we see some votes rolling in, so we'll keep the poll open for another few moments here. And we'll close them in 3, 2, 1. So Pegeen, it looks like a couple of votes came in for improved physical activity and mental health, but almost all of the audience chose all of the above.
All of the above. Yes, so as Ben was pointing out, we are learning more and more about the health impacts of a healthy environment. And as our group came together, we wanted to focus on 3 areas. And I was very fortunate to join in as co-chair in 2014 with Mike Puddester, who's coming from the conservation background, and more recently, Paul Ronan, who's the co-chair from Ontario Parks Association. And so our colleagues wanted to examine 3 areas: research, communication, and policy. And in particular on the research front, we wanted to better understand, well, what is the evidence showing? And I think as Ben has pointed out, there isn't a lot of emerging evidence, but I think intuitively we also get that in terms of when we feel that connection with nature and the impact that it has. So as I mentioned, we do have a research group, and kudos to our colleagues at Toronto Public Health who did a very extensive literature review to be able to describe those physical, mental, and other health benefits of green spaces. At the time, we also had the David Suzuki Foundation, who also did some research in this area. So that gave us a terrific foundation on which to draw on that evidence. And one of the really startling discoveries that Toronto Public Health research found was that not only are green spaces important, but even more so for children who are living in low-income neighborhoods. So that again, people are affected differently, and if we're not conscious about how we plan those green spaces, we are going to perpetuate inequities in our community. This is just a quick summary showing you of some of those attributes of green spaces and then how they directly relate to our health and well-being. And again, if you want to delve in this into more detail, you can find those studies on Ecohealth's website. This is often a green map that we use to help us think about health and the environment. And so often we may think separately, like, oh, we have this natural environment. But if we think about the what we refer to in the health sector as the determinants of health, we appreciate how all these different factors affect our health and well-being, with the natural environment playing such a critical role. And understanding that we can plan how we design the built environment, and there's ways that we can, the built environment can contribute to our health and well-being. And of course, with some of the pressures that we're seeing in urban areas now, there's great concern that we're not paying enough attention to ways that our built environment can promote our health and well-being, and that we can be taking advantage of existing spaces and expanding those green spaces. So we had a chance to work together on our theory of change in terms of, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve? And so this provides you an overview of our vision in terms of wanting to grow a network of people from different sectors who are committed to tackling this issue, that we want to promote the concept of eco-health, we want to gather and share information and build that professional knowledge base. And then we want to find a way to work with decision makers and other professionals so that we can increase the provision of green spaces, build that public awareness, increase the use of green space, and again, enhance that collaboration, and make sure that the outcomes are more client-resistant communities, increased health and well-being, equitable access to green spaces, and the well-distribution high-quality green spaces. And so again, as part of our theory of change, we want to encourage and empower decision makers and professional groups to do what they can within their sphere of influence to protect and increase green space, to increase the use of the green space, especially among those who have the greatest need, to share resources and collaboration across sectors. And as I mentioned, we wanted to work on increasing that evidence base, those communication tools, so that others, this knowledge that you're hearing tonight, that it can be widespread and be embedded and well understood and can be used to guide policy change. So now I'd like to talk to you about some of the different tools and resources that have been created. So often people will say, well, can we put a price tag on trees? How do we quantify that? Can we make a business case? So working with colleagues and outside experts, we were able to create this conceptual framework to understand the business case for Ecohealth in Ontario. So let's say you're working at the local level in a park and you want to be able to build city council support for a new soccer field or a cricket pitch. So using this framework, it provides a very helpful way to analyze what is going to be the health impact and the health savings by creating the space that's going to promote physical activity as well as protect green spaces. And again, how can we start quantifying the value of the tree canopy? So I encourage you to look at this business case that provides this conceptual framework that is linking green space investments, health outcomes, and economic benefits so that those can be used to inform decision making. And as is noted here from the report, green space investments lead to improvements in health and well-being, resulting in health system savings, prevented lost productivity associated with poor health and illness, and reduced mortality. We also have communications, as I mentioned, as a second area. We realize it's really important so that we can find an easy way to talk about these concepts and build support and understanding. So if you go to our website, you'll find a range of resources there in terms of videos, blogs, infographics that are targeted to different professional groups so they can better understand what their role can be and what the impact of their decision making can be on health and well-being. We also wanted to find a way to influence policy. And so we were able to create some case studies. We looked at 10 case studies that showed how eco-health principles and practices by municipalities, public health, and conservation authorities have been integrated into decision-making. So there's all kinds of examples in these case studies of how urban parks are making a difference, protecting and expanding greenbelt areas, watershed management, mood walks, greenways, urban forests. And on the health side, there's issues such as hospitals, how green spaces can support healing. And for example, in this case I'm featuring is greening schools so that those green playgrounds can encourage more competitive, non-competitive and imaginative play and reduce bullying and have strong benefits for early child development. So again, being able to buttress these kinds of arguments about the needed investments with evidence and showing the health consequences and improvements, we feel is a very strong way to build that case. We also created a policy toolkit, and again, it provides examples of what's being done at the municipal level around policies and programs that can enhance the provision of green space and design and access. So often we find people at the municipal level saying, we'd really like to take this on. You know, how can we go about doing this? And if you go through the toolkit, you'll see examples. So for example, here I'm featuring something from the Aurora official plan that talks about how the fundamental principle that they want to guide their design of their community has to do with promoting healthy lifestyles and the provision of highly integrated, environmentally protected lands, parks, and trails, and recognizing that this type of diversity can play a really important role in encouraging community members to have active and healthy lifestyles. And another recent example in Ottawa, they wanted to update their official plan, and a representative from Ottawa Public Health was able to physically be located in the planning department and work side by side with planners to help them use that health lens to think about how they could design their community to promote health, and in particular with that environmental lens in mind. And to the right, you can see a whole range of ways that municipalities can play a critical role in their decision-making and planning to promote access and increase green spaces. So as I mentioned, we've come together from different sectors. We're focusing on building awareness. We're focusing on policy, influencing decision makers and professional leaders in different sectors, and continuing to invest in that research and creating evidence. And so I would be remiss if I didn't ask for participants' feedback tonight in terms of, now, what would you find helpful in your role to be able to advance these eco-health concepts? Would you find it helpful to have more communication tools, create more evidence, develop case studies, toolkits? What would you find as a way that can help us move forward with these, ensuring that eco-health concepts are embedded in decision-making and planning?
All right, we'll keep the poll open for another few moments and close it in 3, 2, 1. And so, Begin, it looks like 33% of the audience said have more communication tools, 7% said create more evidence, 47% said develop more studies, toolkits to influence policy, and 13% said other.
Well, that's really helpful for us to know because, as I mentioned, our colleagues in Ecohealth Ontario and especially leaders, as I say, in public health, have been working on those evidence briefs and making the case. And we heard Ben very articulately describe a lot of that evidence. So it sounds like while there's still work we can do, that we need to put more emphasis around how do we make sure others are understanding these concepts. And again, like the deer in the park, you know, it's right in front of us, but so often people are not bringing that health lens and appreciate how that can contribute to reducing pressure on our healthcare system, increasing health and well-being. And then the toolkits, that's helpful feedback too, in terms of how do people feel, what kind of tools and how can we best equip others, so then in the role that they can play, they can find that they have the examples. Because so often what I hear at the political level is when someone hears someone else has done it and it's been successful, then people are more ready to adapt something that they know has worked elsewhere. And I'm just wondering, for those that clicked other, if you might want to add in the chat box any suggestions or ideas, that things that you would find be really helpful for you. So while people are doing that, I just wanted to mention that, you know, health is such a powerful way to frame environmental issues. And when we started looking at climate change over 7 years ago, some of the research we were finding is that often people feel disassociated from climate change because they can't relate to something happening, say, to a glacier or a polar bear. But when you start talking about people's health and the health of your family and those you love, that people are more apt to say, oh, we should be doing something about this. And it's been very exciting to see that momentum and leadership, for example, at the federal level in terms of climate change now being more readily accepted as an imperative for our society. And so just as eating greens provides us with essential nutrients, so does seeing and being in green places nourishes our body, nourishes our bodies and minds. The physical, spiritual, and psychological benefits of green spaces are increasingly being recognized, along with their ecological and ecosystem benefits. So drawing those connections between green space, community health, ecosystem resilience is really important for our own sustainability and well-being as humans. And municipalities and public health units, environmental groups, non-government agencies, conservation authorities, and others, through the development of policy and programs, and you've got this incredibly important role that you can play in realizing the positive community health outcomes through the provision of green spaces and increasing the design and access. So we're really looking forward to that chance to work with others as we champion these concepts. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that Ontario Public Health Association, we were very excited 2 years ago to launch a campaign about the impact of climate change and health. And again, our research was showing that this was a way to draw in lots of new people in the conversation, as we talked about Lyme disease, for example, and how that those rates of Lyme disease are increasing as a result of a increasingly hot climate, and the impact for those children that have asthma, and what that means for extreme heat. So if you're interested in finding out more about the campaign or getting involved, do sign up for our newsletter at Make It Better Ontario. We also have an environmental work group where we come together from different sectors to tackle public policy issues affecting the environment. And you can follow OPHA on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And as I say, you can also follow us at Ecohealth Ontario. So I really appreciate you giving me that chance to describe, why we think Ecohealth is so important to our future and the kinds of things that we've been doing in research and policy and communications. And we encourage you to check out those tools and resources and let us know how else we can connect and help advance these, what we see as critical concepts for the health and well-being of our province.
Great,
So I'm
thank
happy
you,
to respond to any questions or comments that you might be seeing in the chat box.
Great, yes. So we have a few rolling in right now. This one's from Linda. She says, as a Toronto Zoo volunteer, part of our role is to raise awareness on all the issues discussed here. Would you have a toolkit for volunteers to use as a guide?
I think your best bet is to check out the our website in terms of some of those, like we have videos there, and we also have sort of fact sheets that are describing those links between health and the environment. So if you check out Ecohealth Ontario website, I think you'll find lots of great communication tools. Just as an aside, I don't know if you noticed on my last slide, we've created a toolkit for educators around how to engage children in talking about the impact of climate change. So you might find some interesting messaging in there as well, and practical ideas. On our website with Make It Better Ontario, we also have some short videos that are describing what different groups are doing to try to engage people in the community.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple questions that I'm not sure if they fall entirely under what you do, but I'll pose them and you can let me know. What does Ontario Health do to stop developments that affect green areas like the Oak Ridges moraine?
So as mentioned, I'm with the Ontario Public Health Association, and we're a 70-year-old charity. And part of the reason that many different health professionals and others came together to be part of this association is because we believe in the importance of prevention. And so through our environmental work group, we strategize around what kinds of interventions, what kind of advocacy work, who else should we partner, how do we make our voice heard? So whether that's testifying before provincial legislative committees or working on submissions or meeting with officials. So we are looking province-wide and making our voice heard on issues that where we know there's going to be that impact. At Ecohealth Ontario, many of our members are very active in trying to influence policy. As a group, we decided that we wanted to collaborate to advance the concept, but we're not an advocacy organization per se, but rather we strategize together, and then we all go off as individual groups to do our advocacy work. I also want to mention that Karen Morrison, our next speaker, she's been a long time and great champion of Ecohealth Ontario. So I also invite Karen to jump in because she's been really active on the research and policy front of the work of Ecohealth Ontario.
Okay, I'm not sure if Karen's there right now, but if you do want to jump in at any time, you're free to do so. I guess this answers this other. Oh, Karen.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I don't have anything in particular that I could add to the advocacy conversation, but I think I would say that the more people buy into the idea that there are consequences beyond tree hugging to saving the environment, that is the unfortunate dismissal of environmental arguments traditionally that has been used to allow developers and others with economic interests in alternative uses of the land. The more that we as a society come together and say, actually, no, this has long-term repercussions on our community's health. This is preventative medicine, keeping these ecosystems intact. They are creating the resilient ecosystems that we need to get through the changes in climate that are coming. The more as a society we are able to articulate those concerns, I think the more the conversation will change and is changing as climate change is increasingly driving, fortunately there's finally some leadership, long overdue, driving some of the conversations. I think we need to push that even further. It's not just climate change, it is really our collective future and our children's health and well-being that we're talking about. And so, I think that it's about framing a lot of it and how we talk about issues. And I think what we're trying to do with Ecohealth Ontario is make that health argument and environmental argument as one, because traditionally they have been separate. And I think we've lost a lot of, we've lost that connection as a society, and hopefully we can rebuild it. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, Karen, too, one of the opportunities I think when this group was formed is that many people may not be aware that those 34 public health units that right now are addressing COVID-19, they also have as part of their mandate addressing health hazards. And so they have been involved and will be in the future around issues to do with climate change. And so that's a great force of highly skilled and knowledgeable people who are working across Ontario on these topics as well. So as you say, Karen, this chance for health and environment to come together as opposed to being separate, and that discipline, background, and knowledge and skills of different groups in order to tackle this a critical issue for our sustainability.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. How do you discuss invasive plants in natural areas? Is that something that you discuss at Ecohealth Ontario?
That's not something that I've been involved with. As you can hear, we've been looking at how do we influence policy so that when municipalities are making decisions around land use planning, they've got examples of how health concepts can be embedded. We've been creating that evidence to show the health impacts of the environment, and we've been looking at communication. So that's not an area. Maybe some of our members have been really active in that. For example, our conservation authorities who are members.
Great, thank you. And very last question, do you speak to interested groups? Can people book you? Or does Ecohealth speak to you?
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes. So there are a number of us, and we appreciate that chance to get out and talk and meet with different groups and offer suggestions about ways they can help be champions for this concept of Ecohealth. So just if you want to drop us a line, I can be contacted at pwalsh@opha.on.ca, or if you want to leave your name with the organizer and she can pass that on. And we're pleased to be out and about and meeting with different organizations to talk about why this is so critical and the ways that different groups can get involved and help us create that momentum for change.
Great, lovely. Thank you so much, Pegeen. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Turn this back on here. Great, so last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Karen Morrison. Dr. Morrison is an independent consultant with extensive domestic and international experience. She is the past vice president of the International Association for Ecology and Health, now called Ecohealth International, and a founding member of Ecohealth Ontario. She has a long-standing interest in the relationship between human health and environmental change, and in particular, watersheds as settings for human health and well-being.
Okay, thank you. So I've oversold the presentation already. Just when I look at the title, I'm like, what was I thinking? That's not going to happen. But I was asked to give kind of an overview of Ecohealth and where it came from, and kind of where we're at. And so I'll do my best to tackle some of that. It is a little bit dry, probably, compared to the more organic things that have been discussed already, a little bit more abstract, but hopefully you'll bear with me. So Ecohealth is really considered still one of these new approaches, and I use new in maybe an ironic sense, but it's part of a larger trend towards the valuation or valuing of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science and studies. And so really looking at the need for more holistic perspectives on environmental issues and social issues than just that we were traditionally getting from single disciplines. I don't know why I'm looking at the microphone, that's not really that helpful. So there's been a long-term trend towards more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science to tackle real-world issues that are confronting us that haven't traditionally been well addressed by narrow, very focused, discipline-based science. So part of that trend has also been a recognition of the importance of involving other perspectives and other voices in the kind of work that's being done. And so that began with basically valuing other kinds of science. And believe it or not, of course, there was quite a resistance from quantitative scientists to respecting qualitative research. And hopefully that is long past. But then going on and starting to value professional opinions, professional knowledge about how to get things done, political knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, women's knowledge, other voices, voices that have not, the voices of marginalized groups. So reaching out beyond even the academic disciplines to try to get additional perspective, and how that perspective shapes both the questions that are asked and the kind of answers that come from the questions. And so those are kind of that trend of that new approach is to more broader, more holistic questions that require more than one voice to answer, if indeed it's answerable. So I'm just going to highlight. Oh, sorry.
Can you put your presentation in presentation mode?
Oh, sorry. So here we practice this, and there.
There you go.
I'm sorry, it's not awful. Okay, but I don't really want to see myself here. Okay, at all, but anyway, okay, whatever. So I'm going to talk about One Health. You might have heard that term, you may not have, and also Ecohealth. And so you can see even the way I've represented here is heavily biased, but basically making the case that One Health has come out of looking in the medical system to go beyond, say, just a focus on in the veterinary college on animal health, or in a human health in the medical school, to look more at health broadly in terms of the interconnections between human and animal health. And so that, of course, required more interdisciplinary studies, more voices to come around the table, even if those voices were still of a medical background, so epidemiologists, veterinarians, medical doctors, coming together to discuss issues of common concern related to health. So then Ecohealth is even broader than that, and starting to bring in, of course, the paradigm of where we are, the environment that we live in, and how that environment is also a determinant of our health, and then what are the implications of that, and who needs to be involved when we start to have those conversations about what the environment is and what its influences are. And so emerging out of that, certainly we have Ecohealth Ontario, which I think is a really innovative organization. I'm not aware of anything else like it, where we've had a very organic merge of interests between the public health sector. As mentioned, they did have a little entry point that we were able to take advantage of in the Ontario Public Health standards. And then the conservation areas increasingly wanting to explore the intersection with health and look for common ground, and with the planners and academics and others. So really looking for that common ground that people know is there, but wanting to articulate it and in a way, exploit that field. Now there's an international organization. There has been for several years. It just underwent some growth or change, and it used to be called the International Association for Ecology and Health. It's now a new organization called Ecohealth International, and it has chapters all over the world. That is the same. It's people coming from very different backgrounds, and so from Indigenous knowledge, from gender studies, also from ecology, conservation biology, veterinary medicine, everything, coming together to find that common ground that we're so aware of, but yet somehow have done such a bad job of exploiting. And then I have Ecohealth Alliance here. It used to be a Wildlife Trust, but it still runs the journal Ecohealth, and does a lot of work, primarily coming out of conservation biology, so more of an animal health focus, but of course that's also related to human health, and they do work related to human health, of course, as well. So when I said past, of course I had to go there to Hippocrates. So, these ideas that the environment and health are related are not new, and sadly they're really not new. Hippocrates was writing about this in minus 400 BC, so on air, water, and place, and really thinking about how all of those things come together and influence human health and well-being, and how we need to protect those. And so, but somehow we specialized, and we started to separate the issues around environment and health, and also politicize them. And unfortunately, it's the politicization, particularly of the environmental piece, that has, really, I think, created a barrier to moving forward in this area. So One Health, because it's explicitly kind of health related and has traditionally come from the professional disciplines, and as more of an interdisciplinary in that context, has actually had a little bit of an easier time gaining traction on the global stage. And you can, to be cynical, you can frame a lot of the work between Ecohealth and One Health as one or the other, depending on who you're trying to get funding from, for example. Because the background is different, but where we've gotten to in both One Health and Ecohealth is the very same place. There's also something that I'm not going to really touch on, but you can certainly look up, called planetary health. Similar agenda, but that's more from people coming from maybe global environmental monitoring programs, who are starting to make those connections through climate change to human health from that perspective. But again, these are all interdisciplinary fields with lots of overlap. But just to mention a bit of background where One Health came from. So again, not a new idea, dating back here into the mid-1800s, where a German philosopher, pathologist, sorry, not philosopher, who was really focused on looking at the connections between animal and human health. And he wrote that between animal and human medicine, there are no dividing lines, nor should there be. And he actually coined the term zoonoses for looking at diseases that are transmitted between animals and humans. And so I'll come back to that in a second. Sir William Osler is a Canadian physician, was at McGill, and spent his career, he also worked with Virchow, trying to break down some of the sectoral barriers between human health and veterinary medicine, and trying to create that idea that there was a lot of commonality, and comparative medicine could take, you could learn a lot from really not being so isolated in human and animal health. And then Kelvin Schwabe, who coined the term One Medicine. And so really, again, going to think about anthropology, animal husbandry, free living animals, and human and veterinary medicine as being all one, kind of one broad spectrum of thinking about health. And with the reemergence of zoonoses, but also with concerns over antimicrobial resistance, there's been a real interest in resuscitating these ideas around One Health and how we can work better together to really get more holistic perspectives on how environmental change, exploiting habitats that maybe were formerly unexploited are exposing us to new zoonotic infectious diseases that maybe we wouldn't have been exposed to in the past, and creating the potential for these outbreaks, such as the one, of course, that we're experiencing right now. So a bit of premonition there. But we certainly had warm-ups with SARS, with MERS, from the cattle, and now COVID-19. So EcoHealth has a different trajectory that I think is important in this context to highlight, because it actually harkens back very strongly to the International Joint Commission itself. So this is a wrap of the International Joint Commission. But the Commission itself published this landmark publication in the 1980s called the Ecosystem Approach, and really articulated this idea that ecosystems are complex, dynamic systems that need to be viewed holistically. And so that idea of an ecosystem approach started to permeate the thinking of people who were interested in linking the environment to health. And it developed a field that was known in the early days as ecosystem approaches to health. So literally the ecosystem approach from the IJC to health. And how do we still keep that holistic thinking and incorporate a focus on either human or animal health. So that was in Canada, sort of the early thinking around the ecosystem approach. And then it was picked up by also the Canadian International Development Research Center based in Ottawa, which picked up and ran with this idea of EcoHealth. And through quite a seminal publication that they put out in, I think the 80s or early 90s, called Health and Ecosystem Approach. And I'll show you the cover of that on the next slide. So that was sort of preconditions for EcoHealth, and so really coming out of that ecological side, being picked up by international development, and both of those things have shaped kind of what we know as EcoHealth today. Then various groups came together in the 2000s to form the International Association for Ecology and Health in partnership with the aforementioned EcoHealth Alliance. And now we have EcoHealth International, which kind of took over from the IAEH, and still EcoHealth Alliance running the journal EcoHealth. And so here is this, Jean Lebel wrote this book, Health and Ecosystem Approach, really, again, building on the ecosystem approach from ecology, bringing it into this health through a systems thinking kind of perspective, and moving into the journal, and trying to establish, a field, globally, an international field called EcoHealth. And you can see the themes on the bottom of the journal here. We're One Health, Ecology and Health, and Public Health, sort of macro level themes. So what is ecosystem approaches to health? So, it is contested. I think everyone would give you a somewhat different answer. But essentially, it's accounting for the role of environmental change as a driver of health and well-being, whether it's human health, animal health, again, still depends on the audience. But really this idea of the environment as a determinant of health. And so in public health, we certainly have recognized the social determinants of health, your employment, your education, your family, all of these things, your economic situation as determinants of how healthy you are, but taking that a step further to the place. And so a lot of it can be place-based. Actually, you can enter into EcoHealth. Often I think of it as entering in through a place. So either through a city or a watershed or a park or a school, you can enter into a conversation about, your health, the emergent properties of your health in the place that you're living. You can enter it through an issue like climate change or equity or invasive species was mentioned. You can certainly enter into a conversation about EcoHealth from that perspective, or you can enter in through an illness like COVID-19, like avian influenza, like antimicrobial resistance, Lyme disease was mentioned, ultraviolet light, skin pollution, skin cancer, things like that. So EcoHealth is a reaction to and essentially a criticism of traditional reductionist scientific approaches. that have failed to take into the complexity of social ecological systems. And so there isn't kind of a magic bullet. So even if you're saying, well, what's ecohealth? What's the science, or what does the science say? Well, the science depends on the question, but it's more of a perspective that you take on how you go about answering the question. In a sense, ecohealth is more like a philosophical way of thinking than any particular methodology. So it's linked to systems and complexity science and the study of the whole, but also of its parts. So if you're familiar with the complexity literature, that idea of holons, nested hierarchies of systems. So it's not one methodology, it's a series of approaches that conform to an overarching philosophy that links environmental change to human and animal health in a kind of social ecological systems framework. I think the transdisciplinary nature of ecohealth is one of the things that makes it important, maybe, and that makes it challenging, and that hopefully is helping us find pathways for it that are different than the ones that we've traveled in the past. So again, what is it, whatever that expression is about, if you do things the same and expecting a different outcome. So hopefully if we do things differently, we can get different outcomes. And one of the things we might be able to do better always is incorporating other ways of knowing. And so I think our first speaker today talked about magic, and the magic of being in a place, in an ecosystem, the things that are beyond our current understanding, being open to those other ways of knowing, even if we don't understand them. So that's sort of getting away from that reductionist thinking, having conversations, even with plants, but having conversations with others, other professionals, such as is being done in ecohealth. Other people with their lived experience, people who live in poverty have a very different experience of the environment and how it affects them than maybe people living in a more middle class environment, or even an upper class environment. So the indigenous voices, gendered knowledge, all these different knowledges that we are increasingly understanding as important. And how do we bring those into the conversation about what does it mean to be healthy? What does it mean to create a healthy society, or places that we can live and thrive? So it is Ecohealth, traditionally in Canada at least, because it's mostly been funded by the International Development Research Centre. It's informed by international development principles and practices, including participation and gender and equity and all those good practices. And I'll list sort of the IDRC's principles of ecohealth in a minute. And really coming back to this idea of ecosystems as settings for health. So it's not just a built environment. We're aware that, increasingly aware, and public health has accepted that there is kind of a place-based way of looking at public health, and we increasingly look at urban environments as settings for health. Whether it's a food desert, whether the city is walkable, what the air quality is like, all of these things we accept as being health related to our health in that setting, and then expanding that as ecosystems as settings. So a lot of the work I've done in the past was on watersheds, the idea of a watershed as a setting for health, and what does that mean? And so it can mean different things. We could talk about another time. And so the principles of IDRC's ecohealth research that they articulated in 2 different publications. I've got the covers here on the left. So that health in ecosystem approach that I mentioned previously, and this book here by Dominique Chiron, Ecohealth Research and Practice. So the principles then of ecohealth that we're articulating were participation, equity, complexity, sustainability, transdisciplinarity, and knowledge to action. And so really that idea of being able to, how do we think about not undertaking this work in isolation? If we really care about this issue, we care enough that we don't want to wait for study upon study upon study. We know that that's how we've drowned with climate change, is having to prove to people who will never accept the proof, feeling like we had to prove that science before anything could be done. And so knowledge to action then, how do we start to move forward and not just talk about these issues? And that's, again, the really important thing about Ecohealth Ontario, is trying to drive the agenda forward and not just study it to death. So ecohealth approaches focus on the place of human beings within their environment. This is a quote. from that book. They recognize that there are inextricable links between humans and their biophysical, social, and economic environments, and that these links are reflected in the population's state of health. So really this idea of inextricable links between humans and their biophysical, social, and economic environment. So we've accepted the social and economic, and so of course we should be accepting that there's a biophysical link as well. So going beyond questions from a single discipline to focus on real world, multi-level, complex, uncertain, and messy systems. And so that's really those are the ones that we most need to tackle. Interestingly, the whole trend towards stakeholder engagement in a way has worked against what we've been trying to do. And I had a great quote, I just couldn't dig it out the other day from some work we did on watersheds in Ontario, and talking to somebody from the local public health agency, and basically saying how they recognized that they were sitting at the same table as people from conservation authorities, environmental groups, but they weren't talking from the same perspective. Everyone was wearing their hat, their stakeholder hat. And in a sense, all of this, stakeholders, bringing stakeholders together was supposed to create a more holistic understanding, but instead, in a way, it's reinforced different mindsets and different kind of turf that people had. So when you come to a public health table as a public health stakeholder, you stick to your agenda, and the environmental group sticks to their agenda. And I think through Ecohealth Ontario and other conversations, people realize that actually they always had the same agenda, but that hasn't been obvious. So we're hoping, one of the things that we're hoping Ecohealth Ontario can do is just reinforce the common agenda between a lot of the actors who are at the table, so that it's not, just, keeping picking at each other, but instead seeing that we do have a common set of interests that we should be growing. So this is this idea that in One Health, or you can get these nice maps of disease. This was an avian influenza, and this is not my example. This came from David Weltner-Taves, and I've just stolen it for tonight. David Weltner-Taves is a professor emeritus at the University of Guelph, who is really one of the key figures in building up Ecohealth, at least in Canada. And so he had this idea that you have this map of where these disease outbreaks are taking place, and these maps are almost very reassuring. They kind of tell you, oh, we have a grasp on this illness, and we know what's happening. But then Ecohealth would go and say, okay, that map is very helpful, but what else is there? And so, for example, he looked at in Cambodia, where you had a bunch of clusters of reported avian influenza, but then you had areas that were not reporting any of this illness at all. And so it was like they didn't have avian influenza. There was no reporting of this illness. And so when he went in to find out what was going on in these places that seemed to be immune, thinking, wouldn't that be great? We could learn from the immunity. In fact, what had happened is that these communities actually had what were called singing roosters and singing rooster competitions. And a singing rooster that could really sing is worth in the thousands of American dollars, so US dollars for these singing roosters, and they'll win singing competitions as roosters, and they're valuable. And the Cambodian government, like all the governments around the world during avian influenza, was basically their solution to this zoonotic disease was to kill or cull all of the chickens in the area in order to eliminate that source of avian influenza. And so they were remunerating the farmers for their chickens, but in Cambodian riel. And so maybe if you were paid $500, 500 riel a chicken, you were getting about 15 cents Canadian, whereas you had a rooster that was worth thousands of US dollars. And so of course, you and your neighbors are like, there's no avian influenza in these communities because they do not want all of their chickens culled. And so there's that, we create these kind of feedback loops where we create systems of reporting that instead drive people underground so that they're not having to have the repercussion of having whatever illness it is that we're interested in studying. So some of these feedback loops, kind of this idea that the world is not flat, And how do you find that information out? You can't find that out through a survey. You know, this is knowledge about people in place. And so in a sense, that's EcoHealth. There's many frameworks existing that link human health and natural systems. There's older ones, multiple exposure, multiple effects, which is quite nice. I used to look at flooding a couple of years ago. There's from the Millennium Ecosystem Health, Assessments, of course, linking human well-being and drivers of change and ecosystem services. This one that we quite like from Europe also. We're looking at how the determinants of health include natural habitats and global issues of concern like climate and biodiversity. And this is a more recent one here from the World Health Organization, explicitly talking about climate change and social and biological diversity and how those ultimately affect our health. And so these frameworks are really, I think, important to make it understood that these connections are well known. They're not pie in the sky, you know, and there's data to support them. So in the Great Lakes, we used to have these gross indicators of pollution where we were able to know that there was something going really wrong with the lakes. And it didn't take a lot of tumored fish and a lot of mutated beaks from different persistent organic pollutants. And this is a famous river in Ohio that caught on fire because it was so polluted. You know, people were able to go to the lakes and see with their own eyes, you know, things are not good. So nowadays in the lakes, of course, things are a lot better. The gross signs of pollution are not there. And we have we have to thank the International Joint Commission and the work that it's done, cleaning up the hot spots or the RAPs. And also, my first job actually was working for the IJC on their Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement indicators of health, or indicators under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So some of the indicators of health in the Great Lakes traditionally have been, are they swimmable, fishable, and drinkable? Is the water of the Great Lakes swimmable, fishable, and drinkable? And so then you can get graphs like this that show the percent exceedance of E. coli, for example, in beaches that are reporting from throughout the lakes to the IJC on these different indicators. So, and this was mentioned at the very beginning, this idea of beneficial uses of the lakes, and these would be beneficial use impairments. And so that's how we've linked health to what's going on in the Great Lakes through this idea of how is the environment affecting our health, but specifically, how is it affecting our ability to use the lakes as a resource in terms of how swimmable, fishable, and drinkable they are. And so I would say and I'm going to come back to this idea, why is and so important? So it's not one or the other, and that's that kind of zero-sum thinking that we need to get away with. This is a very useful way of understanding what's going on in the lakes. But then we also have this idea of the lakes as a watershed, as the lakes of a drainage basin of the Great Lakes, either at the scale of a watershed like the Grand or the Don, or of the Great Lakes as a Lake Ontario Basin or the Great Lakes Basin. But then, you know, asking different questions. And that's that kind of ontological sense of like, how are we living in the world? How can we ask things differently about how can we live better in the Great Lakes Basin? And so that kind of very difficult, messy, big picture question would require a lot of different voices to try to answer. And that might be essentially more of an EcoHealth kind of way of thinking about that question. So I mentioned the and, you know, I think it's so easy to say but and or, this or that. Oh, she doesn't like science. She only likes, you know, this holistic stuff. And that's not true. They both have their uses. And so, you know, why not want a healthy environment, and a robust ecology, biodiversity, and health and well-being for ourselves and for the future generation that just came on my webcam a minute ago. And so hopefully through Ecohealth Ontario and through some of the organizations that I mentioned, we can start to tackle some of those big picture questions. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, let me know.
Great, thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
I did have a question, or I have a few over here. Of course, it scrolls down as soon as I try and read them to you. What is the role or impact of the built environment on EcoHealth's mandate?
I think it's a continuation or an extension. Again, I think the public health community was pretty comfortable having a mandate in the built environment, so it didn't really need an organization like Ecohealth Ontario to make that case for the urban space. But the focus of Ecohealth Ontario right now is on green space, and so that is green space within city limits, but also beyond. And so that idea of broader ecological spaces that aren't just within an urban setting. But I think it's important, one of the things that Ecohealth Ontario is trying to do is highlight at the different scales how green space, for example, in a city or in a playground or in a trail, has certain kinds of impacts on human health that are different at different scales. And so if you think about through the case studies that we developed in Ecohealth Ontario, we had one on the idea of watersheds as green spaces. And so that's where you're getting at mortality, deaths from flooding, and morbidity and economic problems from people having to move out of their areas. We looked back in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl when we had deforested most of Ontario and the repercussions that had on community health in Ontario. So the types of health discussions that you have are different at the different scales. I think that's been one of the things that I found most interesting. I don't know if that answers the question.
Karen,
my daughter's building a fort right at my feet.
Wonder if I can jump in. It's Peggy. I was going to mention that I am hearing from some parks colleagues that as a result of the pandemic and people's need to get out and to find spaces, it's put a lot of pressure on parks, and as a result they're getting a lot more attention by municipal councils starting to rethink what are we going to need for the future. So that's a very positive impact, if you will, in terms of giving greater priority to parks in particular and those green spaces as a result of people's demand now and looking for that opportunity to be in green spaces. So it'll be interesting to see what the future repercussions are going to be for our communities as city councilors start feeling that pressure from their community.
Yes, thanks for chiming in there, Pegeen. Okay, this is a bit of a big question, but can you provide an example of an initiative in which the health of nature, other species, and humans was equally considered?
The only thing that I might be able to think of would be those large initiatives like the Boreal Forest Initiative in Canada, protecting large ecosystems. And so that's been done in partnership with some of the big multinational forestry and mining companies, but also with the Indigenous communities living in those forests. I think, yeah, and even, well, when you're protecting a large swath of an ecosystem, you are, habitat is the fundamental thing to protect if you want to protect biodiversity. And by protecting that biodiversity, you're also creating the resilience and the buffering that we need to protect against climate change. So I would say those large scale initiatives may come close because certainly they would prioritize some other species like caribou and other species than just what we have like humans.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably what I could think of offhand.
Great. Next question, I don't know if this is outside of your scope, but where does the traditional field of environmental sanitation fit within your framework?
So my understanding of environmental sanitation would come from when I did a master's degree in environmental engineering, thinking that it was going to be about pollution prevention and control and redesigning industrial processes, and it ended up being about sewage treatment and primarily sewage treatment. So if we take environmental sanitation from that perspective, I think it's part and parcel of our influence on the environment and has direct impacts on our health and well-being over the short and the long term. So certainly environmental sanitation and keeping areas clean and healthful keep us but often we do that by basically shuttling the pollution out to another place. And so that's what we've done with water-based sanitation. And we created huge problems in the lakes by having all the sewage flow into the lakes. So now we're building big holding tanks to try to hold the sewage so that we can treat it before it goes into the lakes. But maybe that whole paradigm needs to shift. A long time ago, I was introduced to a model by a man who worked for the World Bank, and he called it household-based environmental sanitation. And it always stuck with me, as I thought it was a fascinating take. And his idea of household-based environmental sanitation was that people should be dealing with everything that they can deal with at the household level, deal with it. Only things that you can't deal with at the household level, you extend the community. So for example, he would say have composting toilets, have solar generators, do everything that you can do in your house, only where it's maybe either economically unfeasible or it doesn't make good sense to have all of these things decentralized. Then maybe you would have a biogas generator at the community level, for example, to deal with your sanitation issues, or you might have a wind turbine to generate energy for that community. And then only where something is unreasonable at the community level, you expand to the city and further out. And it sort of reverses our traditional way of thinking about these issues, which is, keep our own environment clean by shuttling off and creating those externalities for other people to deal with. And so, I don't know, there's a lot there that could be thought about for sure. But that household-based environmental sanitation model, he published just a few working papers for the World Bank with that title. But I've always thought that it was an idea that was, I think, ahead of its time. And but this idea of decentralization and dealing with things locally is, I think, becoming a little bit more to the forefront and fits with some of the ideas of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment around watershed-based communities, decentralized efforts. It's a long answer, sorry.
No, that was a great answer. And yeah, you brought some really interesting sorry, I think I was just having connectivity issues. Did I cut out? Yeah, apologies. Yes, excellent answers, thank you. So I think that's it for our questions for this evening, and we are getting close to our cutoff time. So with that, I'd just like to thank you, Dr. Morrison. That was an excellent presentation, and I'd like to again thank all of our speakers. I'll just turn my webcam back on here. Yeah, and I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us this evening for our webinar. Thank you, Peggy, and we can see you now. Ben had to run off and get his vaccine, lucky guy. So we're excited for him. But yes, thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope that you learned a lot this evening. Please feel free to reach out with additional questions. We will be sending you additional resources following this presentation. And we'll include a link to the recording if you want to share that with anyone. Please feel free to do so. I hope that you also felt inspired to go out and enjoy some mindful time in nature, especially as the weather starts to get warmer. So this is the last Lake Ontario evening for the next little bit. We don't like to hold these in the summer, particularly with COVID, as after work you should get out and not be on your laptop. Enjoy nature. That's what we're always talking about, right? In the fall, we're already starting to plan what is coming up. In October, we will have Barbara Wall, who is an Indigenous Studies professor at Trent University, and she's also an author, and she will be sharing stories of Indigenous beings of the Great Lakes. She also happens to be the sister of Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. If anyone else loves that book as much as I do, I think it's pretty cool. Yeah, so please do stay tuned. We'll be in touch, and thanks again for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thanks. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.